Okay, session one. So we'll talk about what are spirits. A lot of people know spirits as alcoholic beverages, which is 100% correct, but not all alcoholic beverages are spirits, and not all spirits, well, all spirits are alcoholic beverages, but not all alcoholic beverages are spirits. The difference lies between a very small step that spirits undergo, which is called distillation. So what are spirits? First of all, spirits are alcoholic beverages which are made from raw materials in which sugars are converted into alcohol by a process known as fermentation, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Once the fermentation is done, the second step, which differs in spirits vis-a-vis to things like fermented beverages, which are wines or beer, is a process known as distillation, which basically makes sure that the fermented liquid, which is now alcohol, is further fortified and is converted into something which is more which has more strength, alcoholic strength in it, like about around 40%, which are then now called spirits. So very easy. First of all, the raw materials that go into making spirits are converted into sugars by a process of fermentation, and then after that process of fermentation they are distilled. What happens in distillation is that the strength of alcohol increases to what we require, or the minimum requirement is like around 40%, 35 to 40% of alcohol by volume. Raw materials can be grains, barley, corn, wheat, and rye. Generally, these four or five are used for things like for alcoholic beverages and spirits like whiskey, gin, vodka. Sugarcane juice and molasses are raw materials which go in making rum. Blue agave plant goes in the production of tequila and things like mezcal. One thing to remember very clearly, and we'll talk about a little more on this when we do tequila, is that blue agave is a species, a subspecies rather, of an agave plant which is indigenous to Mexico and South America, Latin America. Um, this particular plant has many varietals. A lot of them, agave varietals, are used in making distilled beverages, spirits, but not all of them can be used in making tequila. Only the blue agave amongst those species are allowed to make into tequila. Potatoes, of course, used in vodka traditionally, and even to this day, although it is changing now. Fruits, of course, grapes, most common, making wine, and then wines are distilled to make brandy and cognac. But also apples and plums and apricot and cherry. So these raw materials, these fruits are also used in making distilled beverages. Fermentation, very basic step that every alcoholic beverages, whether it's distilled or not, has to undergo. Fermentation is a very simple process and has its origins almost 7,000 years ago, where the story I'll share a little later, but let's talk a little bit about what fermentation and the formula of fermentation is. So fermentation is a chemical reaction where glucose and even other sugars in the raw material is broken down by microorganism called yeast to produce ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. And this is a very simple formula which I'll explain to you in a minute. So let's say we have sugar in form of grape juice. Now, if we're talking about wine, let's talk about the raw material that goes in wine, which is the grape juice. So sugar in the grape juice, yeast works on the grape juice, eats up all the sugars, and once it eats up all the sugar, it produces ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. Now, it's very important to remember one thing, that every raw material, whether you talk about grapes, whether you talk about apples, whether you talk about potatoes, whether you talk about blue agave, whether you talk about barley or any other grains, has sugar in it. Some of them, some of those kind of sugars are simple sugars like glucose. Some of them are a little more complex, like starch, which need to be broken down for the yeast to consume, which we'll talk about later as well. Right now, let's concentrate on the formula that is in front of us. What yeast does, yeast needs sugar to survive. So in the process of surviving, yeast eats up the sugar that's in any raw material. And as the yeast eats up, it produces two things. It produces ethyl alcohol, which is also called ethanol, which is the alcohol that we need. Basically, ethyl alcohol is in every spirit, every fermented beverage, beer, wine, whiskey, whatever you name. And it produces CO2, which is generally produced in form of heat. Just to give you an example, we've got three examples. As you can see, you've got a bunch of grapes which are pointing towards a glass, and that is wine. So grapes ferment to produce wine. Similarly, you've got apple which ferments to produce cider. Then you have grain or barley which ferments to produce either beer, and then obviously if it's distilled, things like whiskey and stuff. So this is the first step in any sort of production of spirits. You cannot have a spirit or any alcoholic beverage for that matter unless and until there is no fermentation. Now, the history of fermentation, as I was explaining, goes back a long time ago, almost 7,000 years ago, maybe even before that. How it came across is a mystery to everybody till now. Most people say it was accidental, because you have yeast in environment as well. You have cultured yeast, which is artificial yeast that can be used and is used in things like your breads and stuff. But also there is yeast in the environment, in the atmosphere. So the story goes like there was a traveler who was traveling and had not eaten in a few days. So he stopped over, and that's long time ago, 7,000 years ago. He stopped over, on the side of the road and saw a jar which was full of grapes, and he was very hungry. So he started munching on them. As he started munching on them, he realized that the taste of those grapes was not the taste that it's supposed to be. It was sort of sour, and it was sort of bitter. It was the sugar, it was not as sweet as it's supposed to be. And after a while, the traveler sort of got drunk a little bit. And that was the origin, wherein there was a jar of grapes on the side, and the yeast, the environmental yeast, the yeast that's in the environment, the natural yeast, started acting on it without any human intervention and produced alcohol. Another story goes that similarly there was a jar of honey, and the same action happened there, where in the natural yeast acted on the sugars in honey and produced alcohol. The first alcoholic beverage in the world was mead, MEAD, which is produced from honey. It's still produced to this day. The only problem with fermentation is that it generally can only produce liquor and alcoholic beverages of around maximum to maximum around 15% ABV, 15 or 15.5. What happens after 15% of alcohol by volume is that yeast finds it too much for it to survive. The environment gets very hostile for yeast because the alcoholic content increases, and as you know that higher the alcoholic content increases, the difficult it is for microorganisms to survive. Your sanitizers these days that you use so much are used because they're pure alcohol, so that they kill the microorganisms. So as the alcohol increases in that liquid, the yeast find it difficult to survive and they die. So once the yeast dies, obviously there's no more production of alcohol, and we are stuck at 15% ABV. That's the problem with fermentation, and that is where distillation comes in place. Okay, so let's talk now about distillation. as we described in the last slide, fermentation can only produce alcoholic beverages which are about 15%, but we do have spirits which are about 40% ABV. So how do we reach there? We reach there by a process called distillation. Now, distillation again has been around for many decades, many centuries. As a matter of fact, this is very surprising, and it was even surprising for me when I found out the earliest traces of distillation and a distillate um, has been found not too far away from India. It is found in the present day Pakistan. A contraption which was very basic, which was used to distillate, for distillation. So yeah, the distillation has been around for many years ago. It's just that over a period of time, it has as the technologies advanced, the human civilization started producing better quality distillation products, better quality stills, and which increased the quality of the spirit itself. So what is distillation? Distillation is a process of heating the fermented liquid to a boiling point where due to different boiling points of water and alcohol, evaporation of alcohol occurs in the form of vapor. So now it's not very complicated. It's very easy. As a matter of fact, what humankind found out and discovered is that water, the is that fermented liquid that was produced after fermentation had two things. It had water and it had alcohol. All it needed was to separate the alcohol from the water. It also discovered one thing, that water and alcohol have different boiling points. Water has a boiling point of 100 degrees centigrade and alcohol has a boiling point of 78.5 degrees centigrade, which means that if you boil a pot of alcohol after fermentation, a fermented alcohol, and if you start boiling it, if you start heating it at around 78.5 degrees, the alcohol will evaporate, but the water will stay there. So you are actually separating alcohol from water. And that's what you need. You need to separate the alcohol vapors so that you can concentrate it again. And that's what distillation is in a nutshell. So what happens is that these vapors are channeled through the tube and they are brought into a separate container where they're condensed back in, they're chilled back. And once you chill back the vapors, what do you get? You get liquid. So now this liquid is pure alcohol. Okay, so that is what distillation is. Very simple. No qualms about it. Don't worry at all. So all you need is a beverage after fermentation which has both water and alcohol. You need to separate alcohol from the water. You boil it, you heat it up. As you heat it up, the temperature reaches 78.5. The alcoholic vapors evaporate. They evaporate and they're channeled into another container where they are condensed. As you condense it, it converts back to alcohol. And then you can keep repeating this process over and over again and get even purer. Okay, so yeah. So once this happens, the vapors are divided into three parts. As it starts boiling, the first lot that comes in is called the head. Okay, this head has a lot of impurities. It's not the right product. It doesn't have the right potency of alcohol. So this head, it is put back into the process. The second lot that comes in, the second part that comes in, called the heart, and the heart is the lot that we need to make maximum spirits. This is the best part. This has the maximum flavor, this has a maximum potency, and this is the best part of the distillate. We use heart to make the spirits. Then comes the third part, which is called the tail. The tail, again, same as head, has a lot of impurities. It's not the right product. It is put back into the process. So head and tail are put back into the process. Heart is taken out, and then head and tail keep going back and forth till the time the heart is produced and we get the right product. And that, in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is distillation. We'll talk more about how distillation is carried out, what are the different stills used in distillation in the next session. But that is what fermentation was, and that is what distillation is. You cannot have a liquid, sorry, you cannot have a spirit without fermentation. You cannot have a spirit without distillation. You need to have both processes done, fermentation and distillation.